Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final Healers in Healthcare show for 2023. I am so excited for today's guest. I feel like we are kindred spirits and have connected through LinkedIn. Gotta love social media for that reason. And before I introduce her, I want to go into a little bit more. If you're brand new to this group, I know we have a ton of new members. I want to share a little bit more about the Healers in Healthcare show and this movement in pharmacy and in healthcare. So I always share this book. This is really where it all started. About a year and a half ago, God channeled this divine idea and impressed this on my heart to write a fifth book about healing and to bring all of these people together to share about their stories. And a lot of them have transformational stories of healing that led them to stepping into entrepreneurship and helping to create that domino effect of healing in the world. And so it all started, this movement started with this book. And so if you have this book, there are 19 different examples of people pharmacists who have done everything from financial coaching to holistic healing to functional medicine. And so I know pharmacists we need proof. Like, here's proof right here in this book that it's possible, that you can absolutely monetize your gifts. I always say, turn your gifts to gold so that you can impact your community, because I think of us as beacons of light. So if you see the back, I always have some kind of light image in any of my branding, because I believe that's why we're here, to be beacons of light for the divine, for the collective. And we are all light workers and healers, conduits of healing, to help inspire, empower, encourage our community to heal, because we live in a broken healthcare system, and a lot of us were taught, in pharmacy school, I would say all of us are taught to, okay, here's a disease state, here's the medication for it, suppressing symptoms. And so we know that that does not lead to true sustainable healing. So I wanted to just share a little bit more about that, the movement, before we got into today's episode, which I love this topic. I always enjoy when the Healers in Healthcare show topics are a little bit different, like related to personal development, because that is like the juice. That's the stuff I love talking about. I can talk about functional medicine and these different things, but I think that today's topic specifically, you're going to relate to, because I think all of us have an inner critic, whether she's loud or not so loud anymore, whatever that is. I want to have a real conversation today about how this inner critic shows up. And so I want to bring on the expert, Kate Cozart. I'm so excited to have you here. And yeah, feel free to introduce us and introduce yourself to us, and we'll get started here.
All right. So I'm Kate Cozart. I am a pharmacist who practices in primary care, but also someone who has been through a lot of struggle over the last couple of decades when it comes to really helping to tame that inner critic voice, especially as it came to being an author and being a mom. And so those two pieces were things that were very, very important to me, but I always felt that inner critic was holding me back. And so that was the major premise in me jumping in and starting to write. And so I have a chapter in a recent book that goes into some ways to help tame that inner critic. So just really excited to be here and talk about it.
Yeah, and that's actually how we connected. I think you had something on LinkedIn about, like, we were connected already, but you had something about, hey, if does somebody want to review my chapter? I was like, me, I'll do it. So when I was reading your
Yes.
words, I want to just honor you and celebrate you for a second here. When I was reading your words, I'm a highly sensitive person, and I really feel into the emotion and the energy of the frequency of the words. And I could tell that you are also highly sensitive and in tune with your own emotions, and it came across so beautifully on the page. And I think that it's an art to be a good writer, and you are absolutely a brilliant writer. So I want to just say that you did an amazing job in that piece in the book. What was it called? The Things I Wish I Knew.
Yes,
Discovering the
the book
secrets.
is
Yep. Go ahead.
yep, Things I Wish I Knew is the whole book, and then my chapter, of course, is Things I Wish I Knew about Taming the Inner Critic.
Yeah. So you were saying before about the fact that your inner critic came out with being an author and then being a mom. I'm curious about that. So tell me a little bit more.
So, and obviously, those are not the only times that it has showed up, but
Right, right,
um,
right. Yep.
being being an author, I think, was one of the earliest times that I really remember that inner critic voice. So, um, going way back when I was a kid, I loved to write stories, and I would even compete in competitions that involved like writing a piece, sometimes going and sharing what a book you wrote. And of course, they were small books. We were kids, but there was one particular time where I got invited to this conference, um, and when it came time for me to actually get up and read the little book that I had written, I froze. And it was probably the only time in my life that that's ever happened to me where I just completely like could not do the task that was in front of me. But as an 8-year-old, it really shook me because I thought, well, then I'm just not cut out to do this. Like,
Yeah.
little Kate at the Young Authors Conference all of a sudden said, I guess I'm not ever going to be an author because I'm not cut out to do this. And so that held me back for a lot of years, like 2 decades, before I finally started to like rechannel that part of me that was like, no, like I am someone who wants to create, who wants to write. And so it took a while before I finally was able to figure out that that inner critic voice that said that you'll never be an author, that wasn't
Yeah.
fact. That was just a voice in my head that I had to learn how to change the words of.
Wow. And I want to just attune with that little girl who probably was terrified. Like, having to go up, and it's vulnerable to get up and read or give a speech or whatever that is. And I can see how that would trickle into adulthood of being, I'm assuming fear was part of kind of being held back by being able to speak, whether it's, in person or online or whatever that might be, whatever modality that is. I can relate to that because I remember we had to take a speaking course in college. It was like one of the foundational courses, and I was terrified. I remember reading, I had some kind of paper that I had to present, and I was up there and my hands were shaking and I was so nervous. And I thought to myself at that time, I'm like, oh, like I suck at speaking. I'm just not cut out for this. And here I am, a speaker. Like, it's interesting how sometimes we have those different blocks that we need to work through in order to really own our voice or own these different gifts that we have. So it's interesting how I can like hear myself in your story, as that 8-year-old girl. My 18-year-old self was like, oh, I'm never going to be, all of the stories that come through, which, it all makes sense. It's your body trying to protect itself. And of course, you have like that freeze, like, oh my God, everybody's looking at me, or whatever the thoughts were that were happening.
Mhm.
Yeah. And a lot of
And it's
it,
funny because
go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say, and it's funny because I had done a ton of speaking, over the rest of my, childhood into adolescence. I was really involved in a lot of, organizations, and so speaking, performing was never an issue, except if it was something I created, because
Mm,
that was what held me back.
yeah.
It was, what if the thing that I created isn't enough?
Yep.
And so, you could ask me to go do a public speaking, gig anytime, you know, so to speak. But when it came to sharing something that was vulnerable to me, that was the part that I couldn't get the block off, and be able to really fully let myself be vulnerable and authentic, at least not for a long time.
I was just listening to something, it's related to this. Brene Brown, like, how Instagram has the grid and you can, like, sometimes these random things will pop up. Brene Brown had a video that was talking about how perfectionism is driving the car and shame is in the passenger seat and fear is in the back. And she was saying, oh, it was something about what you just said with like perfectionism. Um, oh, and now I lost it. But it's interesting how sometimes like that does show up. Oh, it was about vulnerability. That's what it was. She's like, the places that you feel most vulnerable, you know, the perfectionism shows up because you're afraid of not being good enough and the unworthiness piece that can come with that. So I just thought that was brilliant because I've heard that before, that, you know, perfectionism and shame sit side by side because it's in that traumatic nervous system response of I have to be perfect to be good enough or else, you know, then the shame kicks in, like, oh my god, and beating yourself up. I know for me it manifested as in my eating, you know, even as early as probably age 13. And I had an eating just two different eating disorders where I was like, I have to be perfect in order to be loved, accepted, worthy, or, you know, I am just a horrible person. So like it was very rigid, and there was a lot of just dieting that happened and just so much of like body shaming within myself. So I think it can show up in so many different aspects of our professional life, of our personal life. So I love that we're having this conversation because this is what shows up too on the entrepreneurial path. We're facing off with ourselves. So,
Hmm.
what do you
For
think
sure.
about that?
Um, you know, I think that one of the things that you just mentioned, I can definitely say, you know, I've struggled too, when it comes to disordered eating. And I think that sometimes that we don't realize that one of the things driving us is the need to feel control somewhere. You
Yep.
know, if we don't feel in control of our environment, of the other things going on in life, it's so easy to lean into that because that's something that I alone control. And
Yep.
so I know that that was also a struggle for me, especially in my teen years and early 20s. And so, you know, thinking about that now, I've realized where that voice came from that told me you're not good enough. And I know that I had to figure out how to dismiss those thoughts. You know, one of the tools that I love talking about and is in the chapter that you've read is, you know, giving your inner critic a name and then telling them to go away. Because one of the earliest moments that I remember as far as feeling body shamed, was when I was 13. And so going back to that time frame, like, and being able to say, like, all of those thoughts that, you know, are still there in my mind. I still remember a lot of comments, but I also know that that's not my thought. And so when I hear those words from that inner critic telling me that you're not good enough, or you're not skinny enough, or you're not perfect enough, I now able to almost put it in a box and say, that's my inner critic talking, and I'm not going to let her stay. I'm going to tell her to go. She's not going to be a part of this room. um, I thought it was so silly the first time I heard someone say, like, name your inner critic so that when the thoughts show up, you can tell them to leave. But it is so dang powerful to be able to say, no, like those thoughts aren't the ones that I'm choosing. So I'm gonna ask her to leave.
Yeah, yeah. And I was just thinking as you were talking that the inner critic is really our brain's way of protecting ourselves. It's because if we come from that fear, that's going to drive our behavior to be thin enough, to be good enough, then maybe we won't be criticized. And so it's all of this protection that comes through in these different coping mechanisms. So people pleasing, perfectionism, um, the fear of being seen, which often is tied with perfectionism because it's like if you come across as a certain way, you're not really showing the vulnerability. You're not showing your authentic self or speaking your truth. And that's what comes through with people pleasing too, because oftentimes with that, you're not really sharing your true feelings. You're like, everything's fine. Oh no, it's okay that that happened, you know. So I think Joe Dispenza talks about this. There's like kind of the way that we appear to the outside, to, on social media as an example, and how we really feel on the inside. And when there's that gap, what's in the gap is all of these undigested emotions. So shame, guilt, and some of these mechanisms that we are just trying to stay safe, to protect ourselves. Because in the past, when we've been vulnerable, like you talked about being, up there and like exposed as an 8-year-old, to like, oh my gosh, well, what are, like, maybe it was a fear of criticism. There was typically a negative consequence that came with it. So we're at all costs trying to protect our reputation, how we look, how we are perceived by other people. But it's very draining. It's extremely
Oh,
draining.
for
So
sure.
I am not saying I am fully healed. I just want to put that out there too, because I'm not. I have iterations of this that still come up, because as an example, like I grew up with a codependent mother and a narcissistic dad. So I tend to, I'm like, oh, like I just want to help you, like even with my clients. And I have to kind of find myself pulling back and saying, what is my job? What is not my job? I cannot create a successful business for you. I can show you and guide you. But those patterns come through in your business with your clients in all of the aspects of entrepreneurship. So I call myself out on that. I'm definitely not perfect at all. So,
Um, yeah, and as you were talking just then, it made me also think like, I do a lot of writing and a lot of talking about imposter syndrome, right? Because especially in healthcare, like we're high achieving people, and it does tend to show up more in people that achieve a lot. And so when you think about the fact that part of what you see on the outside is people afraid to take risk because they're afraid to not be perfect, it all goes back to those thoughts of like, well, it's better to not step out and take a risk. Or maybe
yep,
even for some people, it's they procrastinate to the point that maybe they didn't put their full self into it
right.
intentionally, subconsciously,
Yep,
intentionally, right? So that then their brain's able to say, like, I didn't do my best work. Like they are protecting themselves by putting up those shields of I don't need to do this, I'm not interested in this, or maybe I'm not even going to put my full self into it because then criticism doesn't sting quite as much.
mm, that needs a mic
And
drop.
that's something that I have I've done so much like reading and research around that topic because that's something that, I think we need more people to admit like that is how it's showing up in high achievers. A lot of times we think about the imposter tendencies that we have, and maybe the fact that we just feel a certain way, but it also can show up in how we're willing to put ourselves out there into a space that we want to be in. And so
Right.
I love talking about that particular thing because we protect ourselves so much and are so afraid to be vulnerable.
Yeah, I'm just digesting everything that you're saying right now. It's so good because yeah, if you don't put your full self into it, you're like, ah, whatever. Like I didn't even really try like the whole thing, I didn't really like I dipped my toe in, so whatever. It's okay if I fail, get criticized, whatever. I think I read this once and you brought this up before that one of the biggest fears that human beings have is that we're going to put ourselves out there and do our best and it's still not going to be good enough. And so there's that pain of like rejection or
Mhm.
unworthiness that comes in, even though you were like, I did my best and I did everything that I could in this situation and it still wasn't good enough. So I think that's a huge, huge fear that relates back to what you were just saying about why we do these subtle things with procrastination, um, or completely shutting down whatever the task might be. So, and I think one more thing about this too is just having deep compassion for all these parts. And I think that's one thing that I bring to my coaching is just attuning to that part that just wants to be safe, that just wants love, wants to know that she is good enough. And for me, it's like, yes, addressing the
Hmm.
thoughts, but also trauma lives in the body. So that's why I do with my transformation coaching. It's a lot of that somatic work, whether it's breath work, EFT
Hmm.
tapping, doing nervous system work, because that's the root of it. That's why we have this fight, flight, freeze response, because of that trauma that had happened to us. It could be something like you said before, standing in front of a room, feeling powerless and like, oh my gosh. It could be, there's all different types of trauma. I'm not going to go through all of them, but that's why your body's responding in this way. So, of course, it makes sense. And I feel like when you can attune with that part and say, honey, this makes sense. Of course, your 8-year-old self was terrified. It takes a little bit of that pain, like, and judgment off that might be there. So, I think that's a huge part of healing too.
For sure. I mean, when we actually let ourselves practice self-compassion, it frees up space for us to have this energy that we didn't have before, that allows us to put more empathy and more compassion into the world around us. If we're
Yep.
not giving ourselves compassion, it's really hard to give it to everyone else.
Right. That's in, it's called capacity, right? Like what exactly what you're saying. It's like if we don't have it for ourselves, how can we possibly have it for other people? And I was just talking to my husband about this because I have a family member who is like his trauma manifests in the form of anger. And I never knew up until maybe like a year ago. My mom was like, "Oh yeah, he's this person is unhappy." And I was like, "Duh, 2 plus 2 is 4." But in my mind, like you just said, if you can't give it, you probably don't have it for yourself. So if you can't give love and compassion and kindness to others, you probably don't have it. So this family member that I'm talking about, like, he's angry, he's not happy, so of course that's what's going to be coming out. And unfortunately, sometimes we have to set boundaries with people that we love because we have to, like, protect our own energy. So yeah. So how has this shown up for you? I'm curious. You said about being a mom, so I'm about to be a mommy in 3 months. So how has this inner critic shown up there?
Um, so for me, the biggest way that it showed up was with my 2020 baby, because we were in the middle of, a pandemic, and I had to come back from maternity leave. So I definitely found myself in this space of feeling like I can't do both. I can't be a good provider and a good mom, because what if I'm putting my kid at risk? And so for me, that was really one of the times that I had to face that, you know, um, balance of like, what does it look like to be both? To be a clinician and a mom to a newborn in the middle of something that we don't even know at this point.
Yeah,
Because
talk about
so my middle
uncertainty.
son, he was born in Jan yeah, he was born in January of 2020. So he was only 2 months old when the world shut down.
Wow.
And so, that changed a lot for me. And then, along those same lines, one thing that I really am an advocate to talk about is I had pretty bad postpartum anxiety, and we don't talk about that very much.
Yeah.
We hear about postpartum depression way more, but about 2 weeks before the pandemic officially, was announced, I got diagnosed with postpartum anxiety. So I was already having a lot of anxiety around the safety of my baby and being a mom. And of course, that was something that I didn't know much about. I had never experienced that before. And I didn't know that being a mom to multiple kids, having a history of pregnancy loss, like I had a lot of the risk factors
Right.
for development of postpartum anxiety, but I had no person in my life that was able to normalize what I was feeling.
Right.
And so when I finally talked to my OB about it changed a lot for me because I had a name for what I felt. But then I was also thrown into this new mix of the world is closed. And so when things started to open back up, I was very fearful about, safety, for my
Right?
son, and especially, whether or not I was making the right decisions, surrounding, you know, like can I go into the clinic and do that safely and not put him at risk? Can I
Right.
do, my job? And so that was a big, big trigger for me. And the inner critic voice of like, you shouldn't have chosen healthcare. You shouldn't have even tried to do this if you knew
Mm,
you were going to be a mom. And of course, that's silly to an extent, right? Like looking back, there's no reason that I would have gone, oh, healthcare is not somewhere that I can be safe. But in that moment, I questioned everything and whether I should have gone a different path or known that, I was going to be faced with this dichotomy of can I do both?
yeah. Yeah. There's no way that you could have ever, anybody could have ever predicted COVID. So yeah, that must have been really challenging. Can't even imagine, like having a newborn in the middle of this epidemic, this crisis. Yeah. What would you
Hmm.
say now looking back? What were some of the things that you would either tell yourself now, um, or like how has your perspective shifted around maybe like lessons that you were learning at that time?
I think I had to learn especially in that year in 2020, to start to give myself grace. Like, you're doing the best you can.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the hardest thing for me, as obviously I'm a person with a big science background, right? And so not having all the data yet, like how are we supposed to know what would be safe, what wouldn't be safe? In retrospect, now we know a lot more about, all of that. But at the time, like, we just were all trying to do our best.
Right.
And so I think knowing that I, I learned a lot of grace in that season, for myself, of like, I'm gonna do the best I can with the information I have, you know, um, and it, that's all you can do. Like, no one is perfect as a clinician, no one's perfect as a mom. And so I think that was something that I had to figure out, that it's okay to not be able to say you have a definite answer for something.
And it's kind of a like you talked about control before. Talk about feeling out of control and not knowing what's going to happen or what's safe. Yeah, for sure. I was going to ask you, what role does your
And I
did
mean,
your
something
faith
that,
play?
yeah.
What role did your faith play
um,
in that?
it was really funny. It was it helped a ton, because obviously, like, I'm a person of faith, and so I definitely wanted, to rely on that. And so it was funny because, I'm a person of faith. I'm also a person that is very evidence based as well. And so, trying to figure out, like, what does that balance look like?
Hmm.
Because I believe in God, but I also do believe that, he gives us some information via, modern science. So, like, figuring out what that balance looked like was definitely interesting, for me at least, because I am somebody that, I want to love people well. And so sometimes that would look like me maybe taking precautions that other people around me didn't, because I wanted to show love to the people that I knew that I was around, regardless of whether or not, they were maybe in exactly the same place I was, as far as like their beliefs and things like that. I will readily admit, like, I was probably one of the most conservative people in, my friend and family group, as far as like the precautions that I wanted to take.
Yeah.
Um, but I knew I also serve a very vulnerable population. I primarily specialize in diabetes management. So you're talking about a group of people that I unfortunately saw several of my patients pass away during that first year to year and a half. So
Yeah.
having that, firsthand exposure, I was like I was okay with, I'm gonna trust God that He's got His hand in this, but I'm also gonna be very cautious for the sake of the people that I'm around.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Yeah, and I can feel into what you're saying around like that balance of science and spirituality and faith. So, yeah. What's your disc type? Do you know what you are? Have you ever taken a disc test?
I have. Which one is
So
that?
so it's
I
like
know I've taken it, so tell me what the options are and I'll tell
yeah,
you.
so it's like D is dominance, I is
Is that the one where I'm the protagonist?
no, 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 that's a different one.
Okay.
um yo,
I
I'm
I've probably taken all
curious.
of them, and so I'm trying to remember which one's which.
Yeah, I'm curious which one you
I will
are.
report back. I have
Yes,
them all
report
saved
back.
in a
We need to
file
know in the
somewhere.
comments. So
Will
did
do.
you
Will do.
you also have another book? I'm kind of like switching topics because I don't want to forget this. You wrote your own book, right? Tell me about that.
Yes. 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 So okay, so the chapter on taming the inner critic was one chapter of a book that was already like in process. So I had written that chapter back last November, during a writing sprint that I did. And so then I had the opportunity to put it in a collaborative work, but then also keep the rights to republish it in my full book. And so I jumped on that. I was like, yeah, let's do it. So the full piece should be ready in right around April. So that's the plan, is to get it out in the world here in about 4 more months, 5 more months.
Oh, that's awesome. I thought I saw something that
It
was
is gonna go.
sorry. I think there's a delay in the video. I thought I saw something that you wrote stuff pharmacist like. Is that a is that a book that you wrote?
o- Okay, so that's hilarious. Last year I did a poetry challenge. That was like write a poem a day kind of thing. And I forgot that I did it. And so I got an email, I don't know, maybe last month one day that was like, your book is live. And I'm like, what? I forgot that I even had done that and like it was going to be published at some point in the future.
Yeah.
So yeah, that it's it's a compilation of some different things that I wrote, and a lot of it is very centered around kind of like that training mentality. Like it's meant to be kind of funny, but also like shed light on some of the like realization of what it's like to train in medicine. So some of the poems that I wrote in there are, related to like the long days and not seeing the sunlight, and you're on day whatever and you don't even know when you last had a day off. And so like there are definitely some funny like but also very real things in there. I know one of the ones I wrote, the day that I wrote it, was remembering this case from residency. So when I was in residency, I did a ton of critical care, because at the time I interviewed, I thought that was the specialty I wanted to go into. By the time that I actually went into pharmacy, or was into residency, I knew I wanted to do primary care. But because I had interviewed saying that I was like a critical care junkie, I did a ton of ICU time during residency, and so I enjoyed it. But there was one day specifically where like we had a really um, impressive case with like this saddle PE, and they're like, we need to figure out like how can we do TPA in a very non-traditional way directly, through a PA cath to like treat this thing. And I'm like, let me go find some case reports. And so we like wrote up a plan, a protocol, made it happen. It was so cool. It was one of the like most unique experiences that I got during my PGY1 year. But doing that, I wrote a poem about it because I was like, this was crazy. And so,
I
yeah,
love
some of
it.
it is stuff like that that's just like wild. And yeah, so I'm just a nerd that wrote some poems and
We
then
all
forgot to edit
are.
it.
Yep.
So that is out in the world. That's out
Uh,
in the world, but that is not something that I really was like, oh, I'm gonna like do this. And it was just like I did it on a whim one month, and then it left my brain that it happened.
I love it. Well, you'll have to post in the comments below some of your links and anything that you want to share. Feel free, so that people can find you and follow you. Is there anything else that you wanted to share before we close out, or like I'll ask you too, like where people can find you. But
Okay.
any
Um, so I think that that as far as the things that we've talked about today, like we've talked about compassion and how hard it is to deal with the voice of an inner critic. And one thing that I have seen time and time again, um, especially as I've really been hyper aware of this for the last several years, is that empathy is always the best cure for shame. When you are able to talk to someone who is an empathetic ear, um, and can have compassion for the situation, it can change so much about how you perceive yourself and the situation you're in. And so
mm,
that's one of my biggest takeaways when we talk about this topic is empathy really is the cure for the shame that you often feel. There's going to be a ton more content about this in the other book that is going to come out in the spring. Um, I am pretty sure that I have a title. Someone that took a course that I taught used the word validated to describe how they felt after they read some of the content, and went through some of the videos in my course kind of around the same content. And so I'm thinking that I'm probably going to use that in the title because I do think that that's one of the things that, like, when people talk to me about imposter syndrome and having an inner critic, I want them to leave feeling validated in their feelings, but also validated in the fact that they're not alone and they don't have to
yep,
stay where they are.
yep.
And so that's kind of the underscore of what the book in the spring is really going to try to hit home.
Mm. Oh, I need to get that. I need to get my hands on that. Is there a pre-sale?
Not yet, but hopefully soon. But I do have a plan to have some more chapter pre-readers coming in the next couple of months. So
Oh,
if
that's
you want
so
on the
exciting.
list, I can hook you up.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love it. Well, so let everybody know where can everybody stay connected with you?
Pretty much everywhere. I am most active on LinkedIn, so you can just hunt me down, Kate Cozart, on there. But I also am on um, all of the things. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on
Resilient Farm
TikTok
D. Yep.
sometimes. Um, but yes, Resilient Farm D or the Resilient Farm D, depending
Yep.
on which platform, because Twitter's shorter than the others. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your own healing and some really helpful tips. I know that you talked about some of those in the book chapter, so I cannot wait to dive into this other book that you have coming out in April. I'm celebrating you. I'm celebrating that little 8-year-old Kate that froze, but is doing the damn thing anyway. I love that, and yeah, just thank you so much for your gifts and for everything that you brought to this Healers and Healthcare show for our last episode of this year. I can't believe it because December 26th is the day after Christmas. So I'm like, yeah, we're not doing, we're not having one this year, but our next one is going to be in January. So we'll have Melinda Fowler, who I'm super excited to interview too. She's a client of mine and I can't wait for her to share her brilliance. So yeah, everybody make sure you stay connected with Kate. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe, give us a like. We're going to leave all of Kate's information in the description box. And yeah, we will see you on the next Healers in Healthcare show in January. All right, take care.